Do the existence of moral and epistemic norms prove that non-material things exist? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. So we're considering materialism in philosophy of mind, which, remember, says that when we talk about philosophy of mind, the stuff that we talk about, minds, brains, thoughts, experiences, etc., the only thing that actually exists is material things. And now we're looking at objections to materialism in philosophy of mind. And this one is all about normativity. Normativity is the idea that there are some standards by which we measure something, and that is an interesting point in itself. What exactly is a standard? Well, a standard is a potential way of being by which we measure a thing. So take, for example, this picture that I drew, which I'm not putting this out here because I'm trying to brag about it. I'm showing you as an example of a mistake, something that should never have been made in the first place. I was trying to draw a Boston Terrier, and it definitely did not come out the way that it happened in my mind. And in general, I'm not a good artist. I just was doing this for fun. But when I consider whether or not this was a good picture, I think about, some standard that was in my mind. This is what the picture should look like. And then I measure this picture by that and say, does it match up with that image in my head? No, not at all. So the actual thing is either good or correct or true insofar as it measures up to the standard, and it is bad or false insofar as it fails to measure up to the standard. So one thing to notice is that the thing itself is not identical to the standard by which we measure it. If it were, then we would just say that thing is good just by existing, right? It would already meet the standard because it is the standard. But for almost anything you can think of, it doesn't perfectly match up with the standard that is set for it. So the standard can't be identical to the way that the thing is. And a fortiori, it can't be identical to the matter that makes the thing up. The matter makes up what the thing is. So if the way the thing is distinct from the standard, then the standard can't be the matter of the thing. When I had look at my piece of paper here and the graphite that goes into the picture, that can't be identical to the standard of which I'm comparing this picture to. So it makes sense, all there is here is graphite and paper, right? There's no way that, there's nothing there to be a standard, right? It's just stuff. It's just material. It just is what it is. And of course, this typically isn't a very impressive thing to note because most of the time our standards are imaginary standards. I'm measuring this picture by something that is only in my mind, by the standard that's in my mind. And because of that, it doesn't exist in the real world. So it can't go out and affect my picture. My picture just is a picture, It's not like it's actually a bad picture objectively speaking, It's just paper and graphite. It's only when I compare it to something that is imaginary, something that is in my mind, that I can say whether it's good or bad. But what if we had a standard that was objective, that was outside of the mind? And we have two candidates here that we'll talk about today. One is moral normativity, and the second one is epistemic normativity. So moral normativity is the way that we should be as human beings. This would be a standard that dictates to us, the kind of a thing that we should be. We should be kind, generous, loving creatures, etc., etc. We should not be murderers, rapists, Dallas Cowboy fans. Now consider that first thing that we should not be, murderer. You should not be a murderer. That's what our moral norms should say. First note that the standard of us not being murderers, that we should not be murderers, is not identical to the matter that makes us up. There's nothing inside of me that is a physical thing, a material thing in there that is it's bad for you to be a murderer kind of a thing, right? The stuff that's inside of me is just flesh and blood. That's not a standard. That's just what it is, whether it's a murderer, flesh and blood or not. And it's not, by the way, just in case you're wondering. But second, note that unlike the Boston Terrier example, This is one that would be an objective standard. And now I realize that there are theories of moral anti-realism. I'm going to set those aside, though, for two reasons. One is because most people don't actually believe them. And second, if you watch my video on rejecting moral realism, I talk all about that stuff in that video. So I'll just leave it at that for right now. But the idea here is we have a real standard, moral standard, and that moral standard can't be identical to the matter that makes me up. Therefore, that moral standard must be a real non-material thing. And materialists, remember, in philosophy of mind, said that only material things exist. Well, here's something that deals with philosophy of mind that exists that is a non-material thing. Whether or not, by the way, this is a part of our minds, this doesn't necessarily prove that the mind exists and is a non-material thing. This just proves that some non-material thing exists, so materialism must be false. Of course, you're free to reject the idea that there are such moral norms, or you're free to reject moral realism as well, in which case this argument wouldn't be a problem for you. Things get a little more difficult when you talk about epistemic normativity. Just like moral agency, rationality is a normative kind of a thing. There is a way that we should think. And that way, since it is a standard, can't be a material thing. Now, I realize what you might be thinking, but wait a second. The standard for how we should think, isn't that just we should think the way that the world is? The thoughts in my head should mirror the world out there, and therefore the standard for my thoughts is the world itself, which is a material thing. So the standard for rationality is material. That's not quite right for a couple of reasons. I'll only give one of them, and that is that it matters not just what we believe, but why we believe it. So not just the fact that we believe in true things, but why we believe in those true things. So for example, imagine Socrates and Meno are on their way, they're on the road to Larissa. They're on the road to Larissa, and Meno believes that this is the road to Larissa because he has been there many, many times, and he's always taken this specific route. So he rationally believes that this is going to be the route, once again, that takes him to Larissa. Socrates believes this is the road to Larissa because he flipped a coin and said, hey, if this lands heads, then I know this is the road to Larissa. It lands tails. And then he goes, well, that's 2 out of 3. And he flips it 2 more times, heads both times. He's like, there it is, road to Larissa. Coin never lies. Now notice, both men believe something true. They both believe something correct, but they believe it for different reasons, and it seems like only one of them believe it for the correct reason. Meno believes it for a good reason. Socrates, it seems like he very easily should not have believed that this was the road to Larissa. So Socrates seems like he fails the rationality test here. So there is some way that we should think, right? There's some epistemically normative way of us thinking, and we could call that epistemic warrant. We should believe things because we came about those beliefs in the correct way. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it was fairly easy to reject moral normativity. You could very easily say, I just don't believe there is such a thing as morality. But it's a lot harder to reject epistemic normativity. You would be saying that it doesn't matter why you believe what you believe, and that's, a lot to say. When I ask you the question, really, why do you believe that? The moment you say, I'm throwing out epistemic warrant because X, that giving me that reason X is giving me epistemic warrant, right? You're trying to give me epistemic warrant. It seems like nearly impossible for us to believe something just for totally arbitrary reasons. It seems like we as human beings have got to believe things for rational reasons. So this one is a lot harder to reject than moral normativity. So here's the objection to materialism based on normative facts. Number one, moral and rational normative facts are not material. Number two, if materialism is true, then only material things exist. Number three, therefore, materialism is false. Now, one response that you can have is that although they are not material things, they supervene on the material. And supervenience is a very complicated idea that I really probably shouldn't get into in this video too much. But suffice it to say, the idea is that these would be true normative standards that kind of lay on top of the material things. They don't have an existence of their own, right? They're almost parasitic on the material, even though they are not really material themselves. They still exist, and only exist insofar as they are parasitic on the material. So that would be to say that there really is no immaterial thing in the first place. There is just the material things, and these are kind of extras that come along for free. So here's one example of an idea like this. The idea could be that in moral normativity, our moral norms come from the fact that we were evolved to be cooperative animals, and murder is not a very cooperative thing to do. Therefore, we should not murder, right? So there's an idea of how the moral norm of we should not murder comes about, and how that is an objective thing, even though moral standards aren't real. They don't really exist out there. The trouble is this: why is this a standard that we should follow? You know, what is it about our evolutionary history that makes this a moral norm rather than just a story about our history? I mean, sure, we could adopt this as a standard, but if it's just a matter of us choosing which standards to adopt, then that's totally arbitrary. We're back to that, Boston Terrier standard. The idea is just in my mind of which one of these standards is the one that I want. And in that case, it's purely imaginary. Worse yet, there are standards that are just as plausible, but say the opposite thing. So we evolved as cooperative beings in order to survive. However, we can survive better if we dupe everyone into thinking we're being cooperative while we actually murder people off in secret, take all their stuff, and then blame it on somebody else. Therefore, we should murder. Now notice, this is the exact opposite of what we just said. This is saying that we should murder rather than we shouldn't murder. And which standard should I pick here? It seems like it's totally arbitrary which one you pick. And it's totally arbitrary because this isn't a real objective standard that exists. This is just one that we want to lay on top of the material world. But again, there's no space in material things for standards. So there's no space for normativity. So only a really existent standard would do the job here. And a standard can only be non-material. Therefore, only a really existent non-material thing must exist here. So that's the objection to materialism in philosophy of mind from normativity. If you have any questions on it, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Adios.